Good evening to everybody. When we started working at the chapter archives of Mexico Metropolitan Cathedral, we were not fully aware that we would move between Scylla and Charybdis. I am referring to the historical musicology that has dealt with the music preserved in the archives of the cathedrals in Mexico. Some of the best-known published works had generated myths and prejudices, starting from preconceptions and creating constructions. Myths like that one that there were Renaissance sources in the archives, and the other frequently referred to that the works known until then, that means 1986, were the tip of an iceberg of great musical achievements. Constructions and preconceptions, such as the earliest chapel masters being authors of polyphonic works, or enlightened Novo-Hispanic noblemen being musicians' patrons. Prejudices, such as considering tasteless nonsense the production of the 18th century, and nameless miscellaneous that of the 19th century. Fortunately, we ignored it all and entered the archive with the sole intention of seeing what was there and how we were going to catalog it. Little by little, we confirmed the absence of Renaissance sources and the abundance of 19th century sources. Where had the Renaissance come from? And why had the 19th century been silenced? The second surprise was even bigger because it confronted a myth that has to do with the tip of the iceberg and great musical achievements. It is that of the splendor of cathedral music. Although a myth can be considered as an inferior or distorted product of an understanding and opposed to verifiable truth, it is recognized as plausible and persuasive as long as nothing better is available to talk about certain things. It is valid insofar it means and teaches something to men because it carries and transmits some type of value. The mythical splendor of cathedral music conveys to anyone interested in New Spain that we had a musical past that, being splendid, could be comparable to foreign European musical past. The assessment is part of an ancestral lineage of apologetic and fervent love for the homeland in the face of discrimination of all kinds that the conquered peoples have suffered. The bastardy and indebtedness had consequences that have permeated the societies of what we now call Mexico and have survived throughout the centuries. It is in this historical context that the myth of the splendor of cathedral music was born, and why it still persists. It is a manifestation of a nationalism resulting from colonialism that affects the identity of the Mexican, of such an emotional depth that it goes beyond any political ideology and that places it as part of a cultural system that is still in force. This has resulted in the use of the term splendor in the sense of boom or heyday when referring to the music that was written, performed, and preserved in the Cathedral of Mexico, leading to biased conclusions in a quantitative and qualitative sense. Today we have catalogued 835 collections and 4,244 individual works in collections, of which 1,462 are parts of the ordinary and proper of the Mass, considering the Mass as a collection of individual works. There are 255 antiphons written in square notation in the second half of the 19th century, 369 ballroom dances, and about 450 works by a single author. This synthetic numeralia that you can see is somewhat strange. In any case, for what was the Metropolitan Cathedral of the Viceroyalty of New Spain and the Cathedral of one of the largest countries in Latin America, I do not consider these to be splendid figures. I am quoting myself. What we have catalogued over 18 years, both in music papers and in choir books, does not show such a splendor, especially if you look through a 19th century Central European lens. Neither great works nor famous composers appear, nor large amounts of music of any specific genre or style. On the contrary, the great historical gaps measured in years in which there were no works, as well as the scarcity of local and imported productions, are surprising. From 1534 to 1660, there are no traces of music papers. The 154 villancicos that are preserved are dated from 1693. Those attributable to a chapel master from circa 1600, either they are mythical or they suffered the same fate as others. That means that as occasional works, they had to be replaced. Hence, they could be considered ephemeral art, as were the burial mounds and the triumphal arches. The registration of their authorship and the preservation of their material support differed from that given to liturgical or paraliturgical works that became part of the cathedral's canonical repertoire. It is no coincidence that the music that was preserved from this period, written in New Spain, is dispersed in 8 choir books that contain a meager repertoire of polyphonic works for the office and the Mass, the oldest datable in circa 1600. If in the music archive the oldest work is a Laudate Dominum dated circa 1660, where did the idea of Renaissance sources came from? From the choir books? Today, I can say that precisely this strange numeralia we have just seen, with its excesses and omissions, with its gaps and precodiousness, provides the spoken portrait of a Catholic cathedral in the periphery of the Spanish Empire. It is in the attempt to fill the gaps or to swell the precodiousness that constructions and preconceptions come into play in the absence of empirical evidence. The foregoing leads me to the third surprise, to see that the Cathedral of Mexico, with a music chapel constituted and functioning in the manner of the peninsular ones, with chapel masters who were composers and who followed one another uninterruptedly as in the metropolis, that was a construction that in turn had generated a preconception, to the point of inventing the existence of a first chapel master without a name, without data on his origin, without any record of his actions, but who heads a list where he appears as having spent 3 years in that position. That chapel master and those who followed him were not such, at least not in the first 50 years of the existence of the Cathedral of Mexico. Having believed and continue believing that because you are dealing with a cathedral on Spanish colony, you can deal with it as if you were dealing with one in Peninsula, inevitably leads to results such as the one indicated. It goes against true knowledge, trying to apply the same terms to different realities, not realizing that a new reality, completely unknown to those who lived it and reported it, requires approaches not previously applied. If one does not identify a construction, one ends up feeding it. Worse still, the preconception that this construction generates makes innovations invisible, standardizes differences, automates processes, and nuances are lost for the sake of obtaining the preconceived model. By letting ourselves be guided only by what we saw in documents, papers, books, and other testimonies, we discovered collective practices that had not been talked about, improvisation practices that had not been studied in depth, and characters that we knew very little or nothing about. With surprise, we saw how a much richer, more colorful and interesting panorama appeared than the one provided by the canonical historical musicology. This is how we also discovered, with astonishment, first the construction and then the preconception. Why did the first cathedral in Mexico have almost nothing in common with any other cathedral in Spain? Let's see. Number one, the Spanish conquest was not a colonization. It was a result of a very, very bloody war of an economic, ideological, military nature, which attempted to annihilate the enemy, extinguish their culture, and appropriate the gold and silver of the conquered territory. It was not a black legend. It was history. It is history, and certainly very black. 2. The cultures that clashed could hardly be compared. In Tenochtitlan, that's number 3, the temples were destroyed to their foundations. With thus blood-stained stones, and this is not a metaphor, the construction of the Iglesia Mayor began in 1524, the antecedent of the Cathedral of Mexico. 4. Each individual who arrived in those lands in those first post-conquest years was the bearer of his knowledge, traditions, and ambitions, whether they were heavenly, thus the New Jerusalem, or earthly, silver lingots. The friars and clerics survived on tithes and slave labor. The crown did not pay their salaries as in the metropolis. There were no choirs, no convents, no libraries where they could learn more than they knew or where they could get nourishment to enrich in their tradition. What Peninsular Cathedral could be compared to that of the nascent floating city which could barely stand upright and with a chapter of only 7 members, including the bishop, who performed multiple functions with minimal resources? How to think that there could have been a chapel master in the Spanish style in those conditions? We are then faced with historical musicology that used and continues using concepts and words that make sense in a European reality to name things that make little or no sense at all in an American reality. If we saw all that in the macro level, what about the micro level? The word motet used to name form, style, genre, repertoire indistinctly. A complete set of matins considered as a work of one author, even comparable to an opera. How to trust the words used? After making the inventory of the music archive, we reviewed catalogs from several countries with the multidisciplinary perspective of the seminar where the project was born. Library science, codicology, art history, cultural history, paleography, sociology, restoration, conservation, and computer science have helped us since then to look at things differently. From the beginning of the process, we strive to leave behind prejudices, myths, and inherited terminology. We took the RISM international standards as a guide and started working. We seek to approach each document in the archive with the same respect and attention, without exercising any value judgment, letting each document speak for itself and lead us to its cataloging through a detailed observation of all its elements. Very soon, we saw that crossed-out passages or entire crossed-out folios added texts, written notes and messages, collections built over several years, manuscripts with interventions by various hands and at different times. All these were marks of the life of the works, as well as signals of transformations in the musical life of the cathedral and in the society of the New Spain. Even more, they allowed us to see fragments of the life of the people who had directly participated in that past world. We considered that not only the file as a whole, but even the smallest page written in pencil were sources of information. In other words, from myth and macro preconceptions, we moved on to empirical microhistory. Each document unit, some very complex, was part of a legacy. It became necessary to create a new field in our databases in order to register and explain this. We labeled it synopsis. The decision to make genre our guiding principle in cataloging was of an essential nature. It required delving into each of the factors involved in the concept of genre: title, musical content, and function, in order to understand the meaning of a work and facilitate its comprehension. The function was key because they were works from the archive of the Cathedral of the Spanish Empire settled in a conquered territory in which the original culture was destroyed and prohibited, and in which the Catholic religion was imposed as a conquest and domination ideology. The cathedral and its chapter were only one of the institutional arms of the imperial rule, and music, inseparable from the Catholic liturgy, served to unfold that liturgy, and that was its function, nothing more. Understanding liturgy as a rite and ceremony as a visible representation of the liturgy. If the music was well made and well performed, fine. If it wasn't, it didn't matter, as long as it was music. If there was no chapel master for 10 or 20 years, it didn't matter either, as long as someone kept singing. Taking care of educating and training musicians was never a priority for the chapter, nor for the chapel masters who came from abroad. Nor was there a vice-regal chapel or a nobility that sponsored musicians. Instead, they used those from the cathedral. We only find a thin line of transmission of knowledge in Puebla and, to a lesser degree, in Mexico City during the 17th century. The painters, whose art had a higher cultural value than music in New Spain society, had a guild to control the quality of their work and well-established apprenticeship system. The musicians of the cathedral, on the other hand, were protected by its walls, socially and economically. Once inside, they had nothing to worry about. By virtue of the royal patronage, for 300 years, the Church of New Spain was subject to the Crown and to the Council of Indies, and to the peninsular monopolies for the importation of printed and handwritten music. Its belonging to the universe of the cathedrals of the Hispanic world, characterized by the homogeneity of the repertoire and musical practice, was faithful reflection of a globalized and imperial context. It was compulsory to follow the canon and forbidden to innovate. Any manifestation of acculturation in the music used in the cathedral ritual was unthinkable. What is catalogued today rather shows that the music in this primary venue seems to have functioned with a bare minimum. This precariousness ranged from the number of members of the chapter to the number of chapel masters born and trained in these lands, and from the erection of the cathedral in 1534 to the current situation. After the signing of the Independence Act in 1824, In this cathedral, there were times where the precariousness was not even sufficient, an evident sign that there had been no intention to sow in order to harvest. From the flat nonsense of the 18th century emerged a true composer of international stature. He was European, and his music, of indisputable quality, is very easy to catalogue. Unlike almost 100 pencil sketches from the end of the 19th century, whose musical quality is not a matter of discussion, but which are very difficult to catalogue. These little pieces of paper, never mentioned before, have given us a lot of light on musical practice and the situation of the cathedral in those last years of the 19th century. This is how we have been reading and learning from the archive.
De alguna manera, estas últimas palabras de Lucero Enríquez hacen cierto eco al estudio sobre la historiografía musical que presenta Juan José Carreras, especialmente cuando remarca que, en la segunda mitad del siglo XIX, descubrimientos como el de la música de Bach mostraban de forma impresionante cómo la historiografía musical podía cumplir funciones recuperadoras de monumentos de valor estético inconmensurable. El teórico agrega que un acontecimiento como el del descubrimiento de Bach influiría de forma profunda en la concepción de la historiografía de la música. Ni la historiografía artística ni la literaria se habían planteado una alteración tan profunda de su canon. Carrera finaliza su exposición y para completar la analogía con la conclusión sobre la catalogación del archivo de papeles de música de la Catedral de México, explicando que, cito, la otra cara de la moneda radicaba en la inmensidad de los materiales musicales que paulatinamente se iban estudiando y editando, de valor estético incierto, cuya proliferación creaba una inquietud y malestar que no han dejado de ser actuales. A lo largo de estos más de 10 años que dedicamos a la elaboración de nuestro catálogo musical, fuimos poco a poco comprendiendo que teníamos que modificar nuestra propia percepción del conjunto documental, de sus proyecciones en los ámbitos de la historia y de la música. Hoy pienso que fue justamente esa apertura, esa disposición para el cambio de miradas, en fin, esa flexibilidad de pensamiento que traíamos de nuestra formación como investigadores y principalmente de nuestra sensibilidad como músicos, lo que explica la mayor parte de los logros de nuestro trabajo en la catalogación de este tan singular acervo musical. Como decía, esa apertura nos hizo atender a necesidades de catalogación quizás específicas del material musical que teníamos en manos y nos llevó, entre otras cosas, a incluir, por ejemplo, la sinopsis del material, como se ha mencionado anteriormente. También a generar nuevas tipologías como la de colección de colecciones y a resignificar conceptos catalográficos ya conocidos como el de colección facticia. En la presentación de nuestro catálogo describimos brevemente estos conceptos de la siguiente forma. Colección de colecciones, unidad documental indivisible que contiene 2 o más juegos y o colecciones, o que contiene un juego o colección y una o varias obras autónomas. Colección, juego, serie facticia, facticio, 2 o más obras agrupadas por los catalogadores de acuerdo con criterios específicos. Estas definiciones pueden parecer demasiado objetivas o demasiado subjetivas según la perspectiva que apliquemos en nuestra lectura. por entender que no se trata de un tema de sencilla o clara solución y por siquiera tener la pretensión de presentar una solución perfecta, única y definitiva en esta breve conferencia. Al compartir algunas cuestiones específicas sobre este proceso, además de mostrar ejemplos concretos sacados de nuestro catálogo de papeles de música de la Catedral de México, me arriesgo a conversar con autores que, entiendo, participan menos de lo que deberían de las reflexiones en torno a los archivos musicales y a la manipulación de las informaciones que nos ofrecen. Me refiero especialmente a Karl Dalhaus, fundamental renovador de la historiografía musical, dedicado especialmente al estudio de la música del siglo XIX, y a Michel Foucault, filósofo esencial del siglo XX. En el año 1977 ya nos advertía Dalhaus que el problema de la relación entre el arte y la historia permanecerá sin solución mientras se sostenga la máxima de que el arte se muestra como realmente es en la observación aislada de obras autónomas, por un lado, y por el otro se parta de la premisa de que la historia consiste exclusivamente en la relación de causa y efecto, objetivo y manifestación. Aunque este texto ejemplar estuviera dedicado especialmente a los problemas de la historiografía de la música, para mí es imposible no invitarlo a participar de estas reflexiones en torno a nuestra labor como catalogadores. Entiendo que mucho de lo que se refiere a la rigidez que caracterizó durante décadas y aún caracteriza la práctica de la catalogación musical se explica por la persistencia del pensamiento estructuralista en su afán por identificarlo, categorizarlo y principalmente por normalizarlo todo. Y cito: el formalismo o estructuralismo que se impuso en el siglo XX como estética predominante subraya la distinción entre las obras autónomas centradas en sí mismas y los documentos cuyo punto de referencia está fuera del texto. Lo decisivo es que una obra sea captada a partir de sí misma en lugar de ser captada desde afuera. Termino la cita. Dalhaus explica incluso que en el siglo XX, con la retomada de la idea de obra autónoma, sigo citando, se volvió a desplazar hacia el centro el carácter documental de las obras de arte y a retirárselo del antepatio de la estética. Nada más decepcionante para nosotros, también y principalmente músicos, esa distorsión. Cito: desde el final de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, es característico de la recepción de la música nueva que el interés por la tendencia representada por una obra desplace el interés por la obra en sí. En casos extremos, las obras se convierten en informaciones sobre el estado de la técnica musical que ellas representan. No se las considera estéticamente como creaciones autónomas, sino históricamente como documentos de un proceso histórico del cual forman parte. Es la actitud del iniciado que ha aprendido a ver el presente y la existencia de la obra desde la distancia del historiador. Termina la cita. Ensanchando esa idea, podríamos decir que también se aplica en gran parte a la actitud del catalogador, que encerrado en la rigidez de su propia necesidad de categorización y sistematización, muchas veces no mira hacia los costados, no piensa en el conjunto y finalmente no se permite un acercamiento real a lo que le ofrece el corpus documental y no está sensible a las expresiones musicales sugeridas por ese corpus. El enfrentamiento a esa postura se nota en primera mano en el catálogo que presentamos del Archivo de Papeles de Música de la Catedral de México. Tomemos como ejemplo los resultados de búsqueda para colecciones facticias vinculadas al género responsorio, que nos arroja nuestra propia base de datos. Más de una centena de estos registros se refieren a responsorios incluidos en series o colecciones facticias, o sea, cito, agrupadas por los catalogadores de acuerdo con criterios específicos. Entre ellos encontramos obras de los compositores más expresivos de la Catedral de México, distribuidas a lo largo de prácticamente todos los siglos que comprenden la documentación del archivo. Obras policorales de Salazar, correspondiendo a la tradición musical de la primera mitad del siglo XVIII, obras de Jerusalén y de Tolis de la Roca, con su estilo galante característico de la segunda mitad del mismo siglo, obras de Juanas, creadas bajo la tensión del cambio de mentalidades que marcó la transición entre los siglos XVIII y XIX, y obras de Gómez y de Valle, con sus ejemplares contrafactos del siglo XIX. El tercer volumen de este catálogo, que se ocupa de los juegos de maitines, oficios de difuntos y series de responsorios, entre otros géneros, contiene diversos ejemplos de juegos, colecciones y series facticias cuya integración corresponde frecuentemente a casos de elaboración de nuevas versiones por acción de las manos del propio autor o de otras múltiples manos, contrafactos agregados, reutilización de papeles y otras prácticas, por lo que entendemos bastante comunes en la historia y, ¿por qué no?, en la vida de este archivo. Asumiendo esta distinción, dada la heterogeneidad que presentan estos documentos en todos los sentidos, y aún sin referirnos a uno de los dilemas centrales de la historiografía musical, como lo plantea Davies, que es el juicio que aplican las generaciones subsecuentes al valor histórico versus el valor estético de las obras musicales, al seguir con la reflexión que subsidia nuestra labor como catalogadores, nos preguntamos: ¿a qué orden obedecen estas expresiones históricas de la cultura musical de México? Michel Foucault, cuando propone un estudio sobre la arqueología del saber, de nuestro saber occidental, nos hace notar que los códigos fundamentales de una cultura, los que rigen su lenguaje, sus esquemas perceptivos, sus cambios, sus técnicas, sus valores, la jerarquía de sus prácticas, fijan de antemano para cada hombre los órdenes empíricos con los cuales tendrá algo que ver y dentro de los cuales se reconocerá. En el otro extremo del pensamiento, las teorías científicas o las interpretaciones de los filósofos explican por qué existe un orden en general, a qué ley general obedece, qué principio puede dar cuenta de él, por qué razón se establece este orden y no aquel otro. Pero entre estas dos regiones tan distantes reina un dominio que, debido a su papel de intermediario, no es menos fundamental. Es más confuso, más oscuro y, sin duda, menos fácil de analizar. Es ahí donde una cultura, librándose insensiblemente de los órdenes empíricos que le prescriben sus códigos primarios, instaura una primera distancia con relación a ellos, les hace perder su transparencia inicial, se desprende de sus poderes inmediatos e invisibles, se libera lo suficiente para darse cuenta de que estos órdenes no son los únicos posibles ni los mejores, muchas veces. Quizás el hecho de que hubiéramos percibido la necesidad que nos llevó a la elaboración del concepto de colección de colecciones haya derivado justamente de nuestra flexibilidad y capacidad de instaurar en la trayectoria de elaboración de nuestro catálogo una primera distancia con relación a los códigos primarios de nuestra propia cultura, como nos explica Foucault. Así llegamos a sugerir otra naturaleza de organización para parte del repertorio y creamos como tipología o unidad de catalogación la colección de colecciones. Al invertir la orientación de la catalogación tradicional que parte de una concepción romántica de obra musical y priorizar la indivisibilidad de la unidad documental ante todo, asumimos nuestra postura crítica en relación a una práctica catalográfica cerrada, sistemática y repetitiva. La apertura, la flexibilidad y la reflexión orientan nuestra tarea. Cuando por fin generamos la primera colección de colecciones en nuestro catálogo, unidad documental hoy correspondiente a la asignatura A1455, verdadero rompecabezas, la idea, el concepto, había pasado por un largo proceso de maturación. El caso es bastante anecdótico e ilustrativo y por eso voy a reproducir parte de lo que se ha publicado sobre ello en la presentación del volumen 3 de nuestro catálogo impreso en el 2018 y en el artículo introductorio dedicado por Lucero Enríquez al servicio de maitines en la Catedral de México. Cito: integrada en forma indivisible como una obra matriz, 8 contrafactos, 3 instrumentaciones y 3 versiones, algunas de ellas escritas en papeles reutilizados, ilustra tanto el uso que se dio a los llamados papeles de música del archivo de la Catedral de México, como la precariedad en que llegó a encontrarse la vida musical de esta a mediados del siglo XIX. Más adelante nos dice: en ese contexto se explica una unidad documental muy compleja como lo es la A1455, originada en un responsorio de Bustamante y que se integró con contrafactos, instrumentaciones y versiones de por lo menos 4 autores que tacharon, cortaron, pegaron, añadieron, invalidaron y reusaron folios hasta sumar 8 obras que comparten folios, con lo cual dejó incompleta la obra original. Hacía rato que ya veíamos esas huellas en los papeles. Hacía rato que nos dábamos cuenta que las tipologías y estructuras de catalogación conocidas no ayudaban a entender la especificidad del material con el que estábamos trabajando. Hacía rato. Sin embargo, y una vez más me apoyo en las reflexiones de Foucault, tan impresionante es el peso de nuestra cultura sobre nuestra matriz de pensamiento que necesitamos madurar y lapidar mucho esa idea para liberarnos lo suficiente para darnos cuenta de que el orden que seguíamos no era el único posible, ni mucho menos el mejor. Pero cuando literalmente pasamos página, sentimos que se desataron varios nudos en nuestra práctica como catalogadores. De hecho, fue solamente después, como dije, de larga maturación, que logramos desatar los nudos y presentar una solución catalográfica para otro caso paradigmático del archivo de papeles de música de la Catedral de México. Me refiero a la complejísima colección de colecciones correspondiente a la actual asignatura A0741, unidad encabezada por el cuaderno del organista, así nombrado, que consta de 3 misas de Cruzelaegui, la misa solemne en fa menor de segundo tono, la misa de quinto tono y la misa chica de sexto tono, y de una misa de quinto tono de Navas. Además, contiene una serie de otras colecciones y obras individuales de autor o autores anónimos, una misa romana, una misa de Nuestra Señora una misa de sexto tono del ritual, otra misa del Santísimo de quinto tono y una misa de ángeles. Como si fuera poco, también incluye apuntes de 3 himnos. Como destaca el campo de sinopsis en nuestro catálogo, que informa parte de la trayectoria de esta unidad, y cito, las partes vocales de las misas que integran esta colección de colecciones se caracterizan por estar copiadas con diversas caligrafías, formatos y estados de deterioro diferentes. Se encontraban separadas y algunos cuadernillos dispersos en legajos de miscelánea. La parte de bajo, más órgano, de todas ellas se localiza en un cuaderno del organista que, como dijimos anteriormente, encabeza la colección de colecciones. Su portada indica, cito la portada, varias misas, órgano, se hizo esta copia por disposición del señor de An, don Joaquín Uría, y es propiedad de esta Santa Iglesia Catedral, año de 1895. Los apuntes de himnos mencionados se encuentran escritos a lápiz al final de algunos de los folios de las partes de voz de la misa de quinto tono y de la misa de Nuestra Señora. Finalmente, después del largo proceso de observación, reflexión y aprendizaje, colecciones de colecciones pulcras y orgánicas, como la correspondiente a la asignatura A0134, por ejemplo, que pudieron surgir claras y precisas y concisas en nuestro sistema de catalogación. Esta colección de colecciones consta de 2 juegos de maitines de Antonio Juanas del año 1808. El compositor usó la música de los maitines de Corpus Christi para integrar los maitines de San Juan Bautista, cambiando solo los textos. O sea, el autor hizo 10 contrafactos de su propia obra. Resultaron, por lo tanto, 2 juegos de maitines con la misma instrumentación y que sirven para 2 festividades distintas. Es una colección de colecciones de origen concebida de ese modo por su autor. No se pueden separar desde el punto de vista musical ni tampoco del documental, ya que la partitura de los maitines de Corpus Christi y el guión para los maitines de San Juan Bautista están cosidos el uno con el otro, aunque cada uno tiene su propia foliación. Como si no fuera suficiente, el propio guión está anotado de esta manera. Borrador del invitatorio, himno y 8 responsorios de los maitines de San Juan Baptista, nota. En esta partitura están escritas solamente las voces, las cuales están sacadas de los responsorios que anteceden. Por esta razón sirven los mismos instrumentos y no se copian de nuevo. En fin, creo que después de estos 3 ejemplos ya queda claro el punto que nos llevó a catalogar aproximadamente 60 unidades documentales hasta el momento como colección de colecciones, que están conformadas en su mayor parte por misas, juegos de maitines, juegos de vísperas y oficios de difuntos. Cierro mi pauta insistiendo en las teorías que orientaron esta corta reflexión sobre el proceso de catalogación de los papeles de música de la Catedral de México. Y le paso la palabra a Davies, que hablará de otro aspecto derivado de la revisión de perspectivas y de valores originado a partir de nuestra experiencia directa y abierta con este interesantísimo acervo musical. Muchas gracias.
Good afternoon, guten Tag, and buenas tardes. Printed music comprises only a small minority of the sources conserved at Mexico City Cathedral, a fact that should not be surprising given that little music was printed anywhere in the Hispanic world during the 17th and 18th centuries. Nonetheless, a repertoire of masses, both the Mass Ordinary and the Requiem Mass, printed in Germany and Austria forms a substantial part of the legacy of music conserved at Mexico City Cathedral from the second third of the 19th century, a time of shrinking resources and structural changes that greatly affected musical production at the institution following the consummation of Mexican independence in 1821. Although 19th century music has historically not been the focus of either Musicat or RISM, these sources raise interesting questions regarding cataloging, originality, and the roles of composers, arrangers, and other musicians that are not unique to Mexico, but are visible there. In this section of our presentation, I would like to draw attention to these printed masses in the Mexico City repertoire and discuss some of our solutions to understanding their unexpected complexities. Part of that complexity arises from the nature of the Mass itself, a series of liturgical movements whose variety and diversity remains underestimated in scholarship. In practical situations, an institution would require Masses with different liturgical contents, orchestrations, and lengths to be able to fulfill liturgical expectations on the variety of feasts that involved different personnel on different days of the week and seasons of the year. Whereas in the 17th and 18th centuries, it would be reasonable to expect a chapel master to compose music for such occasions. That was not necessarily the case in the 19th century, when it became increasingly practical for institutions to purchase liturgical music suitable for their resources. However, surviving prints show that instead of simply acquiring and performing music printed abroad, Mexican cathedral musicians arranged, adapted, and rewrote the works to better conform to their liturgical and aesthetic needs. The result is a local version of the European repertoire, perhaps we might say a Creole version that acknowledges both European roots and local creation. It is now a quarter century since Rob Wegman published his notable article From Maker to Composer in the Journal of the American Musicological Society that drew attention to the changing nature of the craft of composition during the second half of the 15th century in the Low Countries. He showed that issues of fame, individual technique, and circulation contributed to a musician such as Obrecht in the early 16th century attaining a higher status as a composer, whereas earlier cathedral musicians were essentially makers who forged repertoires with less individuality. In a recently completed book manuscript that will be published in 2023, I argue that, with a few notable exceptions, most chapel masters in colonial New Spain were more like makers than composers, as they spent most of their careers attending to other musical matters, and some did not compose at all. Contrafacts, arrangements, adaptations, and recompositions are common throughout the history of music in Mexico, and this has profoundly shaped the material present in the archive, although pioneering musicologists in the field were virtually silent on this issue. The idea of chapel masters as masters is simply a glorified illusion. This is especially true of 19th century church musicians, who resemble modern choir directors more than composers, in that their job was to acquire and direct practical music under limited resources, a task some achieved primarily through arrangements and contrafacts. The star representative of this in Mexico City, among others, is Ignacio Trujillo, who died in 1850 and arranged dozens of works for ensembles of wind instruments so that they could be used in services during the 1840s. Organist and composer Jose Antonio Gomez, who lived from 1805 to 1876, also made organ arrangements, as did subsequent musicians in the 1870s and 80s. For context, Mexico City Cathedral did not have a chapel master composer after the death of Antonio Juanas, who had served the institution since 1792 and died about 1821 after ceasing to compose around 1815. In 1838, the musical chapel was disbanded, practically ending the capacity to produce orchestrally accompanied music, except on feast days funded by separate endowments that would enable the occasional hiring of musicians. Thus, for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, quotidian church music would be written for one or two voices accompanied by organ, a reality I shall return to at the end of my discussion. While this mirrored international trends, einstimmige Messen, the reality is that some feast days would support a full orchestra with professional singers, while most would have music for very limited forces. The figure of José Antonio Gómez is interesting in this light, as he could be considered both a maker and a composer, because in addition to his many signed compositions, Gómez created an unsigned anthology of bass lines to a miscellany of masses and other pieces, some with one or two voice lines that could be used for services in which he, as organist, provided the music along with one or two choir chaplains. This Guía del Organista, or Organist's Guide, shelfmark A2209, copied around 1835, contains 22 masses by 18th and 19th century composers. It was Gómez's work as an arranger or compiler, as opposed to his better-known work as a composer, that led us to identify him as the compiler of the anthology through handwriting analysis, as we became attuned to documents showing us practices rather than just texts. Given Gómez's grandiloquent signatures on his own compositions, it seems he valued his role as maker less than his role as composer. This organist's guide, or the organist's notebook already discussed by Analía, is a partial copy of Gómez's organist's guide from 60 years earlier. It is still not known how music for the Mass printed in Augsburg, München, Vienna, and elsewhere made its way to Mexico City in the 1830s and 1840s, before the opening of commercial music stores. A small number of these European prints remained unaltered by local musicians in Mexico, and indeed those show little evidence of use. In our process of cataloging, we discovered that it would be impossible to simply treat these printed masses as concordant copies of European works due to the extent of the local interventions. After months of careful study, we were able to develop 3 typologies by which to catalog these works. I shall discuss only selected Mass ordinaries, although the typologies work for the Requiem Masses as well. The first typology is perhaps the easiest to understand, and perhaps the ideal that church musicians were working for. In this group, 2 independent versions of the work exist: a printed European parent and a Mexican manuscript arrangement. Each of the versions may be performed on its own, with its own scoring, and without the need to borrow parts from the other. An example of this is the Kurze und leichte lateinische Missa No. 3 in F by the Tyrolean composer Stefan Stocker, who lived from 1795 to 1882 and went by the pseudonym L.B. Est. Dating from the 1830s, Stocker's Mass had arrived in Mexico by 1841, when José Ignacio Chiljeque signed the printed title page and created his own version of the work. Importantly, arrangers in Mexico or elsewhere intended no impropriety to the original composers of works like this. The business model of the German publishers was to create flexible pieces that could be adapted to the resources of a variety of churches. For example, this print, like many, is scored for Diskant, Alt und Bass nebst ausgesetzter Orgelstimme, but others have a set of instrumental parts in place of or in addition to that obligato part or Orgelstimme, which might be considered the replacement for the classical orchestra in many churches. José Ignacio Chiljeque created lines for 2 flutes, 2 clarinets, and 2 horns out of Stocker's organ part, and also added ripieno voices. More challenging was the need to bring the Mass into Mexican liturgical practice, as Stocker's original is truly kurz und leicht, short and easy, especially in the Gloria and Credo, which have abbreviated texts. As can be seen in the slide, the Gloria occupies only 4 staves in the original printed soprano part. Treuhecke proceeded by making contrafacts of other parts of the same mass and of other masses by Stocker in order to create a cantata-style Gloria, more like music from the 18th century. The Gratias agimus tibi section in Treuhecke's arrangement, seen in the slide at the bottom of the soprano part, is a contrafact of the Kyrie from Stocker's Lateinische Messe No. 2 in G. Furthermore, Treuhecke deleted the short credo entirely, added rubrics for reducing the length of the Benedictus, and repurposed the music as a missa pro pace, or missa for peace, mass to beg for peace, likely on account of Stocker's original, containing a separate musical section for the concluding Dona Nobis Pacem of the Agnus Dei. Thus, Treuhecke created a new version of Stocker, with a different set of movements, different scoring, and different liturgical content, by using his skill at creating contrafacts, but with little actual composition. Given that the original Stocker version for voices and organ remains intact, we decided to physically separate these versions into two distinct shelf marks, catalog them individually in our database and in RISM, yet note the concordance as another version. Thus, the Stocker print is shelf mark A1060, and the Treuhecke arrangement is A1044. However, in our printed catalog, the two works appear together under a single catalog number with complete entries for version 1 and version 2, plus a synopsis explaining the relationship. In works that follow type 2, the offspring is less independent than in type 1, and the arrangement involves less structural intervention. An example of this at Mexico City is the Lateinische Messe für Fürsingsstimmen und Orgel by Franz Xavier Löhle, who lived from 1792 to 1837, which was dedicated to Crown Prince Maximilian of Bavaria, who would become Maximilian II in 1848. Treuhecke's instrumental parts for flute, 2 clarinets, and trombone, arranged in 1844, complement the voices and obbligato organ of the original print. Treuhecke did not recopy or arrange the voice parts, and thus both print and manuscript would be needed for any performance. The printed and manuscript parts of the Mass remain physically together under a single shelf mark, but to show the existence of the arrangement, we took the unusual step of adding a third incipit for each section. Finally, the works corresponding to type 3 are complex revisions of the printed original, presented physically in such a way that the parent and the child versions are inseparable. In another example from Stocker, namely his ganz kurze und leichte Lateinische Messe No. 2 in G, Treuhecke's arrangement caused interventions in the original parts. Like the other Kurz und leichte Mass by Stocker, the texts of the Gloria and Credo have been abbreviated, and Treuhecke completed the liturgical Gloria by means of contrafacts. In this case, Treuhecke inserted his manuscript extension of the Gloria directly into the original printed part book, also including the bass line of a simple Credo, likely of his own composition, that has no other surviving parts. Treuhecke also rescored Stocker's original, which was for 2 voices and obbligato organ, for 2 choirs of SSB, flutes, clarinets, horns, and bass. The result is an original version, A1059A by Stocker, and an arrangement, A1059B, with an enlarged scoring, expanded Gloria, and different Credo. Given that the versions share folios, the solution was to catalog them using our category of collection of collections, which Analía explained. We have also found in these complex cases, which are common in 19th century music, that writing a curatorial synopsis of the documentary contents in the manner that art historians do for paintings, to be crucial to understanding and remembering the nature of an item's contents. This has not only been possible after years of study, through which these prints and manuscripts have slowly begun to reveal to us how they were actually used in cathedral ritual. I cannot emphasize enough that the act of cataloging greatly surpasses that of inventorying an archive in intellectual scope and hours of work required. I have walked through these three case examples of different typologies of print manuscript combinations in order to show how European music was received and transformed in early independent Mexico for practical purposes. What is obvious from this endeavor is that the European print served as the point of departure for modest adaptations for wind bands, typical of their time and place. We are well aware that with the exception of Type 1, which has two separate shelf marks and records, that most cataloging schemes will suppress the local items as alternative versions without any greater specificity. However, using the RISM catalog, RISM database, it is clear that these Mexican children have orphaned European cousins that might like to know each other. For example, Stocker's Ganz kurze und leichte lateinische Missa number 2 in G, my example 3, turns out to have a younger corollary in Český Krumlov, namely an arrangement by Franz Fechtel, but seemingly no copy of the original Stocker print. Clearly, Trujeke had a colleague 9,981 kilometers away doing similar tasks to similar music. Both Musicat and RISM databases have the capacity to show these Mexican and Czech cousins, but are enough researchers working with the values of exploring original and arranged versions in sufficient detail to allow these databases to locate distantly removed progeny? So far, I have only found such relationships in relatively recently uploaded RISM records. To me, there is an exciting future of learning about typical local church musicians through their non-compositional contributions to music creation in a global context. We are now nearly a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and it has never been more clear how the world has changed since the 20th century. Whereas post-war Europe valued the expression of unity and equivalency across nation-states, hence library sigla and other standardizing and structuralist vestiges. In our time, we can operate globally, despite national governments, to understand shared and unshared pasts. Interest in local and individual identities supersedes nationalism in our epistemology. And indeed in Musicat, we are an international network of individuals, not a congress of national representatives. To me, looking at the global children of a European print is just one way of expanding, if not reversing, 20th century ideologies to encounter ever more layers of nuance and possibility. Thank you. Dankeschön. Gracias.
Coming to understand catalog typologies, such as the one Drew has exemplified, finding their conceptualization and creating the cybernetic solution for them has been and continues to be a dialectical process that does not stop and that continuously generates new knowledge that forces us to reformulate or modify what we have already done. All our projects and publications, as you can see in our web page, have their origin in some way in the archive. Chapter acts, correspondence, and other branches, music papers, and the choir books library have literally been our sources not only of information, but of inspiration. The first product of our most recent project, aimed at the general public using the methodology of the interpretative writing, is based on an 18th century choir book, copied in the 19th century, in which was written what was the improvised counterpoint mentioned in the 16th century chapter acts of the cathedral. This practice is reproduced today in a community from the state of Michoacán that has appropriated it and that suggests us a possible route of how, in the process of Christianization, the music of the cathedrals may have reached the most remote communities of the colony. Reading the documents as we have done, and not looking for a Beethoven from New Spain, is what has allowed us to discover the work of multiple integration, the musical construction of the liturgical services, the complementarity of the repertoires of plain chant and works of other, the constellations of counterfacts or contrafactos, their origin and destiny, some of which we have only recently understood. Our knowledge has widened, and with it, the understanding of what is a past legacy that explains a present and draws a future. We believe that we can share some of these with other countries conquered by Spain, peripheral countries, and with Catholic cathedrals. The great honor with which Dr. Klaus Pichman and Dr. Balázs Mikuzi have distinguished us by inviting to participate in the opening of this conference, with which RISM celebrates its 70th anniversary, also seems to us to be symbolic. When we began to catalog and had the first contacts with RISM, it seemed to us that we were facing a somewhat cryptic, rather inaccessible, closed and self-contained human and cybernetic structure. The change that has taken place in RISM in recent years has been spectacular, at least for us. It has been getting closer to the cataloger, making more flexible the access to its system, opening its fields to diversity, and allowing the multiple integration of its online catalog. For us, it really means having reached the port we needed after sailing for 18 years. We see a promising future, and not without challenges. Perhaps the main one can be phrased in a question: how to preserve universality while allowing the particularities of diversity? Being gathered here today shows that it is the task of all of us, those of us who work with, for, and from RISM. Thank you very much.